Sophia Hartfield, a talented architect who sacrificed her career for a controlling marriage, hits rock bottom after divorce and ends up dumpster diving to survive. She is unexpectedly bequeathed her estranged great-uncle Theodore's $50 million estate on the condition she lead Hartfield architecture for a year. Thrust into power, Sophia reclaims her voice, launches a fellowship for underserved students, defeats internal sabotage and a spiteful ex-husband's legal attacks, falls in love with Jacob Sterling, a supportive senior partner, and uses her inheritance to launch public-focused architectural projects that change lives, fulfilling Theodore's long game to make her choose and grow. The dumpster was a small, loud world of shrieks and rust. Sophia's hand groped through damp paper and splintered wood until her fingers closed on a chair leg carved, heavy, an improbable ornament from a life that felt miles away. Dawn cut silver through the slats. Trash birds argued on the roof. She hauled herself up, caught the smell of mildew and motor oil, and the memory of someone telling her she wasn't worth the air she breathed. A woman's heels clicked on the pavement. Sophia straightened, heart already scheduling shame. The woman wore a suit that ate light. "Excuse me, Sophia Hartfield?" Her voice was flat, careful. Around her wrist, a bracelet winked like a private bank account. Sophia looked ridiculous, fingernails black with rot, hair crooked, the chair leg clutched like contraband. "If you're here to repo something, that's literally all I own." Her laugh was a dry leaf. "My name's Victoria Chin," the woman said. "I'm an attorney. You should sit down." She handed a card with a hand that didn't tremble. "Your great-uncle Theodore passed. He left you his estate." The words landed like cold bricks. Estate. Hartfield. The name had lived in photographs on a mantle she couldn't remember touching. It had been a promise in a voice that had stopped coming. Sophia wanted a punchline. The universe owed her one. Instead, she found herself standing at the edge of possibility, smelling the city's early coffee and something terrifically like fear. "There's a catch," Victoria added. "You must assume the CEO position at Hartfield Architecture within 30 days and hold it for a year, or the estate goes elsewhere." She tried to picture herself in a marble boardroom instead of a dumpster. At 21, she'd sketched a community center on napkins, and anyone who'd seen it had said the same thing: "You'll change the city." At 22, she'd married an easy charm called Richard and traded blueprints for grocery lists, watched her paper dreams folded into a husband's pockets. At 32, she had a single suitcase, a laptop with a cracked hinge, and a set of notebooks where her life lived in ink. Victoria's car smelled of leather and quiet competence. "You'll need clothes," she said, not unkind. "We leave tomorrow." There was a tautness in Sophia's chest that felt like hope dressed in panic. She tucked the chair leg under her arm as if anchoring herself to the present. They flew to the city on a plane that liquefied memory into light. Manhattan rose, a serrated skyline of promises and threats. The Hartfield brownstone sat like an argument made manifest, heavy in tradition, but with glass that blinked toward tomorrow. The front door opened and a woman with hands that smelled of lemon and old kindness said, "Welcome home." Inside, the house held the precise sadness of a museum that once loved someone: frames with empty faces, a room waiting to be used, a studio shut but neat like an unused lung. On the 5th floor, light spilled across drafting tables and a chair that had once been sat in by someone who believed in her. A sketched plan was pinned to the wall, a young woman's alphabet of lines and angles, the earliest notes of a life half-lived. In the quiet that followed, Sophia heard a voice she hadn't let herself trust, the voice that had once said, "You're brilliant." It was thin with distance and fierce with faith. Theodore had built a room and waited. That waiting felt like accusation and salvation, all at once. Outside, the city held the day. Inside, she held a chair leg and the trembling, enormous possibility that whatever she'd lost might be waiting in the drawings she'd kept hidden for a decade. The studio on the 5th floor felt like walking into someone's private theorem. Light fell across a drafting table smoothed by decades of palms, and the air had the faint, intoxicating tang of graphite, coffee, and old paper. Margaret, who had kept the house more faithfully than anyone, moved with the easy surety of a person who had sustained a household of legends and now had to welcome a prodigal back into its geometry. "You should look around," she said, her voice a soft map of the past. "He kept this for you." On a corkboard, a small exclamation point in a room full of restraint, there was Sophia's college sketch, the one that had won the prize, yellowed at the edges. It had been pinned there for years like proof. She had been someone once. That afternoon, the conference room felt like an audition. 8 men circled a long table, their faces a ledger of loyalty and suspicion. "Miss Hartfield," Carmichael said before anyone else could, "you have no experience." This will be the rest of the sentence dissolved in the polished air. Sophia closed her notebook as if it were an instrument. Inside were years of clandestine sketches, systems she'd imagined between diaper changes and dinners she'd served with a smile that was actually suffocating. "Then let me be instructive," she said. She didn't pull out polished renders or glossy slides. She opened a blank sheet and began to draw. Lines came like memory. A massing here, a cutaway there. She described rain gardens, thermal chimneys, facades that breathed. Her voice found the cadence of someone who had been practicing on paper for years, hands and eyes synchronized, the language of form returning from exile. Jacob Sterling watched, not like a predator, but like a person who'd been waiting to be convinced. When she finished, the room had shifted, some of the hardness softened. Carmichael's mouth compressed into a rule he'd been taught to obey: protect what we've built. But others leaned forward. The board voted to give her a trial. 30 days would become 45 meetings, a crash course in legalese and PR, in portfolio reviews, and late nights, where coffee became a physical necessity and not a ritual. Days blurred into a montage of learning. Jacob became her scaffolding. Project tours, client dinners, the language of budgets and margins that felt as foreign as another language. But the work, drawing section through section, matching environmental strategy to client need, coaxing a price point into sustainability, reminded her who she was. At night she read Theodore's old notes in his hand, scrawlings that admitted failings, experiments that failed forward. They were blueprints of a mind that hardened itself around ideas and softened itself around people. But the firm was an ecosystem with predators. Files disappeared, rehearsed objections coalesced into whisper campaigns, and someone attempted to sabotage a presentation by corrupting her deck. It was subtle, a thumb in a well-oiled machine, a reminder that the old guards feared disruption. Sophia learned the difference between discomfort and hostile intent. She also learned the strange clarity that comes when you realize the worst that can happen is something you've already survived. Outside the office, the city began to know her name. The Hartfield Fellowship she sketched into existence was a sliver of rebellion, paid positions for young designers from underserved neighborhoods, mentorship that wasn't mercy but apprenticeship. Theodore's portfolios, the messy drafts he left in a bottom drawer, became teaching tools. The firm, which for years had been a cathedral to polished completion, began cracking open into a studio again. Jacob and Sophia worked late, drafts strewn like the evidence of 2 people building an argument together. There was a sturdiness in their collaboration that felt different from the brittle negotiations she'd known in marriage. He asked careful questions. She answered with line weight and conviction. When he clasped a coffee cup between callous fingers and said, "You're not pretending," it landed like a prayer that had finally been answered. But not everyone applauded. Rumors swirled about nepotism and manipulation. A rival planted stories that the fellowship exploited young talent. A major project's presentation became the test. If she failed, the doubters would have proof. If she succeeded, the firm, and maybe Sophia herself, would change the rules. The morning of the Anderson pitch arrived with the thin, choked light of a city that hadn't yet decided whether to be kind. Sophia's models had been on display the night before, meticulous and alive. The computer held the renderings, the walkthroughs, the carefully layered narrative that a tech billionaire wanted a living building tuned to seasons and data. She walked into the conference room carrying the fragile calm of someone who had rehearsed the words a dozen ways. At 9:45, she opened her laptop. Empty. The file showed fragments, corrupted thumbnails, error language that crawled like a technical lesion. Her throat closed. Carmichael hovered at the door, smiling that predator smile, casually comfortable in chaos. "Someone moved it to the break room," he said. "Perhaps you should check." Jacob's jaw tightened. He offered options in the quiet way of people who plan contingencies. Sophia realized she had 30 seconds to decide how she wanted to be known. She could panic. She could retreat. Instead, she did what she'd always been trained to do before Richard learned to make decision by shame. She improvised. She moved to the whiteboard and began to draw with a confidence that surprised even her. Line became story. She traced the building's relationship to wind, to neighbors, to the client's brand. She explained materials, not as commodities but as caretakers, how a terrace absorbed rain and returned community, how glass would learn the sun's rhythm. Anderson leaned forward, eyes like a man who'd been waiting for someone to understand him. The team watched as the sketches became a living proposal. Jacob slipped colors and depth into her lines. The room, which had expected spectacle, received instead an act of revelation. When the clients left, their faces were not the guarded neutrality of the commercially allied, they were expectant. In the aftermath, the board asked 3 questions: who corrupted the files, who benefits, and how are we going to stop it? The trace led back to a machine Carmichael had used. There was a tiny signature in the metadata, an oblique breadcrumb that told a story of intent. He reacted like a man who'd been caught in the theater of composure. He called it a coincidence. The forensic record called it sabotage. Sophia could have demanded his head. Instead, she did something more dangerous. She set the terms of power. She offered him a dignified exit, a settlement, severance, non-disparagement, with a clear timeline. The board split along old loyalties. Some wanted the conflict played out public and ugly, others wanted quiet and continuity. Sophia wanted the firm to be able to breathe. She wanted people who would stay to be people who stayed for the work, not the perks. That night, a journal surfaced from behind a stack of Theodore's trial models. It was leathered and small, the kind of book people hide in drawers when grief is still a new doctrine. She read his handwriting in a room that smelled of night and dust. He wrote, repeatedly and tenderly, about watching her decline in a marriage that had been both cradle and cage. He'd been stubborn and proud, he admitted, and then he'd been afraid that interference would only make her resist. So he waited. He built a studio. He left a will that would force a choice, but also a chance. The discovery tilted the world. Suddenly, the inheritance wasn't merely wealth, it was a test designed not to entrap but to retrieve. It reframed the petty betrayals at the firm as the predictable defense of people who'd never imagined a woman would weld compassion to business. And it carved a quiet path forward. She now had the authority to remove those who used sabotage as a tool and to build structures that made room for voices like hers. When Richard's name reappeared in a blind email, thinly veiled hope for reconciliation, she deleted it without flinching. The legal noise would come for her eventually, she knew. Men like him found creative ways to be victims in their own narratives. But for the first time in years, she had things on her side: evidence, allies, a studio that was no longer a memory, and a resolve that was no longer negotiable. The city outside went on being indifferent and brilliant. Inside the studio, Sophia began to sketch not because she had to but because she wanted to. The line weight was firmer. The stakes were higher. And for the first time, the idea of building something for the public felt less like a concept and more like an obligation. The intrigue that had simmered into a standoff boiled into bricks and briefs. Carmichael resigned under pressure, his exit clanging like a door finally closed. But victory came with an echo. Richard's lawyers filed a suit alleging that Sophia's career gains were marital assets, arguing that the education and ideas she developed while married had been enabled by him. The claim was absurd on the surface and poisonous by design. It weaponized narrative, trying to turn sympathy into legal leverage. Victoria prepared a counterattack with the exactness of a seasoned general. They unearthed journals where Sophia had documented 10 years of micro-raids on her confidence, missed exam registrations, canceled interviews, offhand dismissals of ambition. These weren't anecdotes. They were a pattern of emotional and logistical sabotage. The firm's HR records, Margaret's careful testimony about how Theodore had maintained a studio for Sophia, just in case, and emails showing Richard's pattern formed a legal lattice. When reporters smelled blood, they arrived like gulls. The courthouse became a stage for public memory. Sophia rehearsed restraint like a muscle, say the truth plainly, avoid spectacle, keep the argument rooted in facts. The courtroom demanded clarity, and Sophia discovered that clarity had a strange joy of its own. It allowed her a moral posture that was not brittle, the dignity that comes from truth told with evidence. Victoria's cross-examination did not need theatrics. It only needed the patience of a person who knows how systems bend in the absence of witness. She brought forward counselors, receipts, and the small wounding phrases Richard used to make a career sound like vanity. Under oath, the mask slipped. People watched a facade crumble into pattern. Outside, the architecture community polarized. Marcus Chin, a rival CEO, amplified whispers. Hartfield Fellowship was exploited. The firm was in chaos. The new CEO was a sentimental liability. The op-eds stacked up like storms. Sophia wrote an essay, "Buildings Are Social Contracts." She framed the fellowship not as corporate PR but as structural correction, paid positions, apprenticeships, mentorship with teeth. Schools reposted it. Students wrote to say the idea felt like oxygen. Back at Hartfield, the fellowship's first cohort arrived, raw with possibility. Emma, a young woman from Brooklyn with soaked hands and a sketchbook of gardens for shelters, arrived with a look Sophia recognized, the taste of doubt and the hunger beneath. Sophia took Emma's shaky hand and offered something no test could demand: time, space, and responsibility. When Emma led a community meeting at a shelter site and translated design into an organ of hope, Sophia felt a proof she couldn't have purchased. The courtroom delivered a reprieve. Richard's claim was dismissed. The judge called the suit retaliatory. For once, legal language became mercy, not because the law granted reunion, but because it recognized abuse disguised as kindness. The ruling did not erase the decade lost, but it made the chapter public, and that publicness only amplified Sophia's voice. The public reaction was a crucible. For some, she was a cautionary tale. For others, a map. People who had been told to stop dreaming wrote to say they'd take back their blueprints. Schools invited her to speak. Fellow firms implemented paid mentorship programs. Architects and activists began drafting policy proposals about paid internships and community-centered design. Theodore's portfolios circulated beyond the firm. They became curricula. And then came the acquisition offer. Marcus Chen's firm on the table with $300 million staring up like an altar. The board wanted to know whether legacy could be bought. The offer would secure financial freedom for Hartfield's endowment, for projects, for a lifetime of philanthropic work. But it also meant dissolving the fellowship, handing the Hartfield name to a firm with a history of conservative consolidation. Sophia stood in Theodore's studio. The envelopes of his life spread like leaves. The ring in his handwriting, a band etched with blueprints, and his final admonition, pressed at her palm. This was the decision her uncle had planned for: mission versus money, stewardship versus liquidation. He'd left a crucible for a reason, and the moment arrived now, compressed and merciless. When the board leaned into fiscal logic, Sophia surprised them. She refused the sale. The choice rippled like a stone in a still pond. Contracts clattered, spreadsheets recalculated, some board members stiffened, others exhaled as if a long-held breath had finally left their chests. Theodore had left her a secondary trust, a test for moral constancy. She chose to keep the firm whole, to protect the fellowship, and to preserve the living architecture Theodore prized. That night on the rooftop, with the city like a constellation of unfinished sketches, Jacob took her hand. "You could have cashed out," he said gently. "You didn't." Sophia looked at the horizon and felt the weight of a year condensed into a choice that tasted like her own voice. "I didn't want the legacy sold to someone who doesn't see people as buildings are seen here, as things that deserve to be tended," she said. He kissed the top of her hand, not as a suitor but as a co-conspirator. "You're changing what success looks like." She pressed Theodore's small band to her chest. The test had been administered. She'd passed not because of inheritance, but because she chose to be the kind of leader Theodore had hoped she would be: brave, contentious, and tender. The courtroom's hush was the kind that rearranged breathing. Cameras were beyond the heavy doors, but their hum leaked through like distant seas. The judge's gavel brought a gravity that felt like sunlight through a curtained window, decisive and ultimately cleansing. When the motion to dismiss Richard's suit was granted, the room exhaled. Sophia's knees wanted to go soft, but she stood. The legal victory didn't erase a decade of lost chances, but it delivered a public accounting, a formal acknowledgement that what had been disguised as support was control. Outside the courthouse, the city pulsed with the aftermath. Reporters crowded, microphones like inquisitive fists. Sophia spoke with the measured force she had learned in the studio. "This is not about revenge," she said. "This is about boundaries. I used to let people define my limits. Today, I set them." Her words moved through the crowd and landed in people whose own lives were lines waiting for bold strokes. The fallout squeezed Richard into a corner. Former colleagues stepped away, clients of his firm asked uncomfortable questions and then left. He sued, he slandered, he attempted petty partnership extortion, narrative attacks that are the last refuge of the vanquished. But the law had set a precedent. The moral perimeter had shifted. Other women came forward, their stories aligning like tectonic plates. It wasn't a spectacle of punishment, it was a community unveiling of patterns. At Hartfield, the victory released kinetic energy. The fellowship students moved from theoretical exercises to real contracts. Emma's shelter design was greenlit with community participation funds. Her prototype became a replicable unit for cities across the East Coast. The design included indoor gardens tended by residents, multi-use rooms for vocational training, and a facade that invited light without exposing vulnerability. It was, in a phrase, architecture that saw people. Meanwhile, Marcus Chen's acquisition gambit had collapsed spectacularly. The board had anticipated the leverage of capital. Sophia had anticipated the cost to mission. When the extra trust, the $30 million Theodore had hidden to reward a leader who would not be tempted by pure profit, was revealed, the firm finally had an independent bankroll to scale the fellowship and public projects without ceding identity. The trust was both a reward and a final lesson. Money was a tool, but not a master. In the studio that night, after press calls and staff meetings and 100 small consolations, Jacob found her staring at a spread of Theodore's portfolios. "He left you more than buildings," he said softly. "He left you a way to test yourself." Sophia smiled without irony. "He made me choose what kind of architect I'd be." Jacob had stood beside her through the legal storm and the boardroom theatrics. Their relationship, careful, tender, sometimes laughably awkward, had become a steady architecture of its own. He didn't rescue her, he partnered. When he asked her, in that late hour, to imagine a life beyond the emergency room of public opinion, her answer came shaped by months of practice. "I want to build systems that outlast our headlines." They married not as a coronation, but as a quiet public vow, two makers promising to raise scaffolds that would sustain other people's possibilities. The ceremony in the rooftop garden was small, saturated with late light and the smell of herbs that Margaret insisted on growing there. Emma stood beside Sophia, having grown from an applicant into a project leader. Theodore's old friends came, offering toasts that were part eulogy and part benediction. That night, when Jacob put a ring beside Theodore's band, the gesture felt like two timelines overlapping, one of legacy, one of future. It was not a replacement for what had been stolen from her years before. It was the affirmation that she had reclaimed the lines and angles of her own life. The city below seemed to agree, lights unfolding like the first page of a new blueprint. In the weeks that followed, the fellowship's pilot projects opened to the public. Children used libraries designed for play and learning. Seniors found community rooms that invited them to teach. Media called it a model for rethinking how architecture could serve society. But the measure that mattered most was quieter. When a young designer told her, "You made me imagine again," Sophia understood that the great work wasn't in awards or panels, but in the slow accretion of dignity. Richard's attempts to return dimmed into irrelevance. He sued, settled, and closed his practice. The law had performed its work, but the community's judgment was faster. The sound that replaced the chaos in Sophia's life was not applause so much as the hum of studio activity, printers clicking, models being assembled, students arguing about materials into the small hours. It felt like home. For Sophia, the climax was not a single moment, but the culmination of a year where she fought to be seen and then used that seeing to let others in. The firm breathed differently now. The office had become a place where people were allowed to be brilliant and messy at the same time. She had walked into power with the rawness of someone who'd been broken and come out more dangerous precisely because she loved. Spring came with the smell of new timber and the sound of drills. The first Hartfield Community Library opened on a gray morning that folded into a blue afternoon. Emma led the ribbon cutting with hands that didn't shake. Children streamed in and discovered corners that were built for discovery, low shelves for small hands, tables for sketching, a garden out back where native plants whispered a curriculum of seasons. The documentary that had once been a risk aired and resonated. People wrote letters that did not ask for pity but for paths. "Where did you start?" they asked. Sophia answered honestly, at the edge of a dumpster and in the ledgered margins of love that had been both shelter and cage. She spoke about repair, not just of buildings but of lives. She insisted, politely and a little fiercely, that architecture is an ethical practice as much as an aesthetic one. Hartfield architecture settled into a rhythm that surprised everyone, least of all those who had once assumed it would collapse without menacing male oversight. The fellowship became a national model. 3 other firms modeled similar paid trainee programs. Schools altered curricula. A small policy initiative that Jacob helped put together encouraged municipal funding for apprenticeships in design, a practical tool, not cheap talk. Margaret lingered longer at the estate, her hands finally resting easy. She told Sophia that Theodore had planned for the long game because he believed in patient love. "You took the test because you wanted to choose," she said. Sophia felt that phrase settle like a beam into place. She had taken the test and then chosen a distinction that mattered. In the studio, Jacob and Sophia planned projects that Thomas had sketched but not built, community centers that were both pragmatic and quietly beautiful, schools that invited sunlight into textbooks, housing that did not feel like punishment for poverty. The work cost money, but they had learned how to make dollars follow mission, not the other way around. The trust Theodore left, once a trap in the mind and a gift in the hand, had become seed. Their marriage found its own architecture. They argued about materials and budgets and occasionally left a meeting because one of them was tired. They learned boundaries, undoing the old patterns that had made love into cage. When Jacob surprised her with a weekend trip to the coast and a small sketchbook she'd been wanting, Sophia felt the ordinary joy of being known. It was not a fairy tale. It was better, a negotiated life. Time did strange things. The man who had once been her husband dwindled into background noise, a cautionary footnote in articles. For him, a scandal collapsed a life he'd tried to steady by controlling others. For Sophia, the emptiness he left was filled with projects and people and an increasing conviction that institutions could be changed. 5 years after the dumpster, Sophia stood at a commencement podium at her alma mater. She looked out at a sea of faces, young, hopeful, frightened by the same blank pages she had once feared, and told them, "We are trained to reconstruct from ruins. Use what you know to make room for other people. Build something beautiful, but be kind about it. Architecture at its best is a promise." She signed the line on a public contract for 20 community projects spanning 4 states. She watched Emma present a model for a health center that folded clinical care into communal space. She watched Jacob exchange a knowing glance with a contractor who had once doubted her. The gesture was small, but it felt monumental. The world had remodeled itself to make space for people who'd been excluded. On the rooftop at dusk, she uncrossed her hands and looked at the skyline where the Hartfield buildings were now part of the city's quiet grammar. Jacob slid an arm around her and rested his head against hers. The rings on her finger, Theodore's blueprint band and Jacob's thin diamond, caught the last light. They were markers of a life reconstructed, history acknowledged, Present chosen, future planned. She thought of the woman who dug through trash and the little chair leg she'd clutched like proof she was real. She'd built from it, not a tower of revenge, but a home for possibility. That was the inheritance. Money had helped scaffold the work, but the real asset had always been a steadiness that refused to let others draw her lines. In the end, the best architecture she practiced was the kind that taught people to stand upright again. As the city glimmered, Sophia whispered an apology to the younger self she would never again ignore, and a thank you to a man who had believed long enough to wait. Then she and Jacob went downstairs where Margaret had set a table of simple food and friends, where a quiet life waited to be lived and designed, full of small, stubborn, luminous things.